Grazie mille. Thank you so much for these welcoming speeches and addresses. So without further ado, we're gonna pass to the much expected Meet the Ambassadors session. So we have some very distinguished ambassadors here today, and they're all Swiss ambassadors from the MENA region. It's my pleasure to introduce and ask to come on the scene Florence Tinguely Mattli. She's the Swiss ambassador to Qatar. And please welcome, you can take a seat in the middle. She used to be also the ambassador in Denmark, Liechtenstein and Tanzania. Ahla wa sahla. Then we have His Excellency Thomas Oertle. He's a Swiss ambassador to Oman and Yemen. Ahla wa sahla, Thomas. Then on screen, and I hope it's working, we have Her Excellency Monika Schmutz Kirgöz. She's a Swiss ambassador to Italy. Benvenuta. Bienvenue.
Buonasera a tutti e a tutti.
Benvenuta. And last but not least, who's actually from Ticino, His Excellency Roberto Balzaretti. He is a Swiss ambassador to France. Bienvenue, bonsoir, Roberto.
Grazie, buonasera.
And last but not least, the moderator of tonight, the Special Envoy for MENA region, Ambassador Wolfgang Amadeus Brülhart. Please. Welcome, and the floor is all yours. Enjoy.
Grazie, Diana. Stimata rettrice, stimata consigliera di Stato, onorevole municipale, I would like to thank you very much for hosting this MEM Summit, for hosting the young change makers, for your warm welcome and also for your support. Thank you very much. Dear participants, it's a great pleasure for me to be again in Lugano, to be with you and to be with my colleagues to discuss mediation in a very complex world. And my first questions to you is, in your life, when you were a child or teenager or parents, what was your experience or an example where you were mediator? Roberto, cominciamo con te.
Bene, grazie. Buonasera a tutti. You start with me, but I fear I will have to deceive you immediately. I always been a kind of, can I say, more a negotiator than a mediator. So, you know, I was born nearby Lugano, so in the region where you are. And then I moved to university in the Swiss-German part of Switzerland. At the time I studied at university, there were no university in Ticino. This is quite a new setup we have. Well, new, it's 20 years old, but I'm more than 50. And so my first experiences were experiences of negotiating how to adapt to a new environment, to a new situation, rather than mediate. It's also quite interesting because what you learn from these first experiences is then very useful in your life and was very useful later on in my life as a diplomat. You have to learn to know your strengths and weaknesses. You have to learn to deal with others, to learn to adapt to others and influence others. And so the first thing I remember was that, you know, coming into a new city, it was Bern at the time, a new language, a new setting, new colleagues, a new environment, and coming from a cultural and linguistic minority, you know, my mother tongue is Italian, having to, judge strengths and weaknesses in order to, with the time, to come along with people who has become since colleagues and for some of them friends.
Grazie. Monika Aroma, what was your first experience as a mediator? As a child, parent?
Or as a teenager, you said.
Or a
Buonasera a
teenager.
tutte e a tutti. Yeah, no. My first reaction would be, I still feel like a teenager. And I think, yeah. And I'm very, very happy to be able to address all of you. Good evening to the change makers. Yeah, you know, I would say, okay, I feel like I come from a multicultural and a multi-religious family. I still live in a multicultural and multi-religious family, being also married to someone who has a totally different background. So my colleague Roberto Balzaretti maybe would say you need to be a very good negotiator. I can say you also need to be a good mediator, and I feel I have been one since day one, you know, in all these, with all these different backgrounds. I feel it's also important to underline it, because we have the young change makers that come mostly from the Middle East. I will tell you later on how I experienced, you know, mediation during my many years in the Middle East. Maybe it's also my chance to quickly say to everyone that is present that I'm still the lucky Swiss ambassador to Italy. And soon I will leave this fantastic place to Roberto Balzaretti, who is going to move from Paris to Rome, to go back to Bern and be the head of the MENA section. I have quite some experience in the Middle East and will maybe develop more on that in the next round. Thank you.
Grazie, Monika. Thomas, what was your personal experience?
Buonasera a tutti, è anche un piacere di essere qui. I think for me it was really in childhood that it started, where I had my first experiences in trying to mediate between my parents when there were tensions, trying to bring them to find common ground. Probably I was not very successful, because in the end they ended up in separating and divorcing. So my first attempts of mediating were unsuccessful, but I think that was the first attempts to try to also see the perspective of the other and try to explain and to find common ground. But I'm also very happy to be here. For the past almost 20 years I have been working in or on the Middle East, so looking forward to the exchange with all of you.
Merci, Thomas and Florence.
Merci. Working? Yeah. Thank you very much for having me. I think for negotiation that I can recall, as a young professional, I was in charge for the state of Geneva to convince all parties of the government to make the analysis of, well, I was in charge of, I was attaché for European affairs, so I was in charge by the State Council of Geneva to coordinate all the works for a possible introduction of European Economic Area law. So I had to convince, mediate between trade unions, between representative of professionals, representative of the professional associations and the government, and to have everyone on board to see how we could integrate those European norms in cantonal law. And there were some sessions where I think I've lost 1 kilo just trying to have everyone on board and convincing them that we had to find a solution which was acceptable by all of them. But I would like to say that I think in terms of mediation, the best place for me is really the family. And when you learn the diplomatic job, when you have teenagers at home, and you have to have everyone on board and make sure that they behave. I think that's just down-to-earth situations where you're in your family and friend area, you learn the job.
Thank you. So let's go from the private experience, the first private experience, to the professional life. You had also, Roberto said he was more negotiator, not mediator. So, Roberto, we have here change makers. They would like to be once a negotiator or mediator. So what are your takeaways as a negotiator for your experience for the young change makers here?
Well, perhaps without being too long and bother everyone, I started quite young in participating in delegations, negotiating agreements, and mainly in the first phase of my career, those were economic agreements, so investment protection, trade agreements, agreements for the avoidance of double taxation. And the first takeaway is that if you are part of a delegation where there is a head of delegation, there is usually a more experienced person doing the job, well, profit from every moment you can to learn how he or she is doing that, listen to what he's doing, how he's behaving, how he's interacting with the counterpart. I think that this is the main takeaways as a member of a delegation. When then you have the chance to move up and be yourself a negotiator, well, then there are two or three things you should do. The first thing I guess is to perfectly know your subject matters. So know your file in detail, know what you're doing before knowing what the counterpart is doing. Because if you don't know where your strengths and weaknesses, where your limits, your limitations are, then it's very difficult to negotiate. In particular, in countries like Switzerland, where you have a very large democratic basis, controlling what you're doing, interfering with what you're doing. It's not only the government, the parliament, but the social, the civil society at large. Then, know your file, know your limits, and this is probably the most important things of all, listen to what is being said to you by the counterpart. Don't be selective on what you listen to everything, and build upon that in order to find a common solution. And I think that is my third takeaway, is probably the most important. You have to build trust. You have to establish trust, and when you establish trust, then you're credible in what you're doing. But the only way to establish trust is to show that you are listening to what you are presented with, and that you really want to build something together. I think that these are the takeaways. I've been negotiating many agreements since, some with some success, some with less success. It's not a matter of succeeding, it's a matter of conducting your job in a way that allow yourself to stand up in the morning and say, well, I did what I could in good faith, and I will continue doing so.
Thank you very much, Roberto, for these very precious takeaways. Monika, in your diplomatic life, you were more negotiator or mediator? Or do you have also examples?
Thank you so much, Wolfgang. I think I was more a mediator, but then eventually at the end it's the same thing, because what we learn from Roberto Balzaretti, I think it's amazing. I would have said more or less the same, maybe in different words. He says, know your file, be prepared. I would have said, be a nerd. It sounds weird, but I think being a nerd and really being well prepared, that helps a lot. Then, of course, I would add empathy. Empathy is just another word for what Roberto said. Listen well, read between the lines. I think empathy is so super important. And something else, if I think about my experiences as a mediator, I was mostly very unsuccessful. And I will give you a few examples. But I think this is important. Mediation must not end up in success. You can be unsuccessful and still eventually be a good mediator. Thomas Oertle told us about his first mediation steps when he was a child, mediating between his parents, and he said he was mostly unsuccessful. It was also Ambassador Oertle. We were more or less in the same ship, when we had all these communication channels to Hamas and Hezbollah, which I think were very useful to the Swiss foreign policy for so many years. But if you look at the situation in the Middle East these days, we were probably mostly unsuccessful again, but still I do believe that these channels of communication were useful and might eventually one day be used again. Then I wanted to give you an example a little bit more like concrete, like everyday's work of a diplomat. I think all of us in diplomacy, and not only, this is also valid for people working for non-governmental organizations, we always have to be mediators and translators. Even here in Italy, I have to explain how the Italians think and work to Bern. And, and then I have to explain my Roman contacts here that we, the Swiss in Bern, we are functioning kind of very differently. So this is also an act of mediation. But to come back to the Middle East, you might know I was ambassador in Lebanon. When I came there, one of my biggest tasks was, to integrate two entities. One entity being the embassy, the other entity, was the Swiss Development and Cooperation Office. Now, the most interesting part of this integration was that in the embassy there were only Christians working, and in the development office there were many Sunnis and also Shia Muslims working. And I can tell you that as a mediation effort, this was not really easy. I think this was one of my successes after I mentioned a lot of unsuccessful mediations I have been part of. It was rather successful, but sometimes it goes into details that one would not expect. I can tell you we have been discussing for weeks, about which holy holiday shall be an official holiday of the once integrated Swiss embassy, because before there were mostly Christian holidays, but then of course you also have Sunni and Shia holidays. It was a very long process, and I think we were quite successful at the end because every religious community could celebrate their most important religious holiday. Thank you.
Thank you, Monika. Thomas, do you have cases in your professional life?
Yeah, I mean, it would be preposterous for me to define me as a negotiator, with Roberto having really been the chief negotiator for many years, or also mediator. But of course, during the course of the years, you have experiences where you have to negotiate or to mediate. And I would like to give you 3 examples that and 3 key takeaways. One is that sometimes the home front, the negotiation at the home front, is actually the more difficult one. I had to negotiate with the Syrian government the opening of a humanitarian office in Damascus. And I can tell you that the Syrian government, they are tough negotiators, but it was nothing compared with the discussions that we had back in Bern to find an agreement. So very often the home front is the most difficult one when you negotiate. A second example is more from the negotiation perspective, and Monika mentioned the translation. We try to see if we can reduce the humanitarian impact of sanctions, and we facilitated an exchange between officers that are in charge of sanctions, so from Treasury or from the economic departments, together with humanitarian workers. And their language, they didn't speak the same language, and the fears that they had, and the goals behind the restrictive measures, it was so different that we constantly had actually to play this translation role in order that the 2 parties actually could communicate with each other. So translation might be an important part. And the third, and it's probably something which is important in everyday's life, is just seize the moments or create moments. The country I'm in, the Sultanate of Oman, when you try to negotiate agreements, memoranda of understanding or so, it usually takes a very long time. It's a strong bureaucracy, and it might take years to actually bring a file forward. Now, last year we had the chance of having the 50th anniversary of our diplomatic relations, and we managed to have a visit of our president to the Sultanate of Oman. And of course, that's a unique opportunity where you can actually push through things that otherwise would have taken years. And we managed to, within a couple of weeks, actually, to have agreements on various subjects. So when you have the opportunity, seize it, because it can actually change a whole of a lot.
Thank you, Thomas. The world today is more and more complex. We have more and more conflicts, but also we have more and more mediators, especially the countries of the Gulf, Qatar, Oman, the Emiratis, the Saudis, become mediator. So Florence, you are in Doha. In today's world of mediation, can one country be the only one who mediates, or do you need 2, 3, 4 countries who do it together? What is your experience in Doha?
Well, as you said, the world is getting more complex. The number of different situation contexts are growing. We certainly left a pattern where we had Western values-led world. We see more geopolitical, other countries, the geopolitics is changing, with going a bit eastward, and many countries also asking for their voice to be heard. Conflicts in between states, but also with different groups, where you have really to take into consideration different history, religious background, and probably it was easier before, when the international law and so were less, and values were less contested, to negotiate under a set of rules by traditional negotiators, one of them being Switzerland. So depending on the context, and if we look at Gaza, but if we look at Afghanistan, but even Ukraine, we see that we need to partner with other countries to be able to reach an agreement and to bring some solutions. So in the case of Qatar, Qatar has been doing some negotiations on his own, with some good success, with a clear line following the international law, be very consequent on that, trying to be impartial, but using some advantages that the country has, being culturally, being religiously, being also in their wealth, but also in their ability to mediate very quickly, to take decisions very quickly. So in a case, for example, of Ukraine, or we have Switzerland have been partnering with Qatar to prepare also the Ukraine Summit on Peace. We had a good cooperation, and we actually, the state of Qatar hosted one of the preparation meeting before the Summit on Peace. And the Prime Minister attended, and Qatar was the only Gulf country to sign also the declaration, helping Europe to have another balance, and to be also that the Summit on Peace was also validated by non-European countries. In another context where actually Switzerland wouldn't have been able to solve a question, that was the exchange of prisoners between Iran and the United States, a deal that came through last September 2023. So Iran and US wanted to exchange prisoners. It was also in the deal around $6 billion that were assets from Iran that were blocked in South Korea. And Switzerland, as a representative protecting power of the US to Iran, and with our financial expertise, we were on board to help the deal to come through. But it was important and very instrumental that another country that is also benefiting the trust of Iran, Qatar, was also on board. And through many months of very discreet negotiation, showing that we had trust between the two negotiators, and we had the trust also of Iran and the US, we managed to arrange a deal, and September 23, so there was the exchange of the prisoners in Doha. It was also very useful at the end that Qatar could also finance the plane and other things to smooth the end of the deal. And the money is now, the 6 billion is now in Qatar and will be used for humanitarian purposes in Iran. But it was very important that Qatar was ready to host this money because of the trust that Iran places also in Qatar. After the 7th of October, everything is frozen, but the money is still there. Just to say that I think that now the complexity of the negotiations, the context is such that it is really an asset for us to be able to cooperate with some countries, Oman, Qatar, so that we put together our different expertise and forces.
Thank you, Florence. So mediation as teamwork of states, I think that's a new development we see. And last Tuesday, during the MEM seminar, I worked with the change makers on mediation facilitation. So we had an 8-hour workshop, and we elaborated also some questions for the colleague ambassadors. So I would like to give the floor first to Maher for his first questions. Maher, you have the floor.
Thank you so
Welcome.
much. Thank you. Given Switzerland's commitment to mediation, how might we deploy the dialogue itself not just as a tool within mediation or negotiation processes, but as the foundational principle for addressing and resolving conflict? Could a paradigm shift toward dialogue as the primary framework offer a more sustainable approach to peace, particularly in light of the escalating crisis in the Middle East, in Gaza, in Lebanon, in Syria, where I grew up, in Aleppo, since 13 years, there's no solution with the mediation. So how could be with a dialogue as a tool to start find solution? Thank you so much.
Shukran. Thomas, is that a question for you?
I will try. It's not an easy question. I mean, definitely, direct or indirect dialogue is crucial, and it's certainly one of the key pillars in every mediation or peace process. And but it's not necessarily so easy, and I don't know if it's sufficient also. If you want to have a sustainable peace, you might need transitional justice and other elements that might be as important. But dialogue certainly is key. But I think there are a couple of examples where that show you that it might not be so easy. Switzerland has been supporting the Geneva Initiative for 20 years almost, where Palestinian and Israeli people tried actually, besides developing the most comprehensive blueprint of a possible two-state solution, they tried to bring people together and to foster dialogue. But after a couple of years, what we realized is that the dialogue was amongst the converted. So they were preaching to the converted. It was not those circles that were antagonistic. So you just continued actually to have these rounds of workshops where on the Palestinian side, those that were ready to reach out their hand to the Israelis were participating and vice versa. But it didn't have an effect where it was growing. On the contrary, actually, it was more and more marginalized. So I think that attempt was not necessarily successful in the sense that it was leading the path towards a more comprehensive solution. There's also a danger when you, for a state like Switzerland, if you try to give a platform for dialogue, you might have negotiators from parties that are willing to come to discuss with each other. But we have seen it in different contexts that there is sort of a dialogue business taking place. So negotiators liking to go to lavish hotels and taking per diems and talking to each other and having actually no interest that things progress. So you have to make sure as a state that is hosting dialogue how to prevent this to happen, because it might be actually counterproductive. It might incite people to just keep the conflict so that they can continue to benefit from this international attention that is being given to them. So I'm not saying that dialogue is not important. On the contrary, I think it's very important, but it's not just a panacea to solve everything. And I think one has to carefully design a dialogue process. I also think if you look at national dialogues, for example, there's always one challenge also: how many people do you involve? Are you involving only those that have the muscles? And forgetting about the business people, the women, the marginalized group? Or do you involve everybody, but then you have so many stakeholders that you might actually almost not progress? So I think, and I think there is not an easy answer. And coming back to the question that was asked before, I think that's why you need different stakeholders. You might need NGOs doing some track 3, we're bringing people together, and then you have states that try to bring the decision holders together, and there needs to be coordination between these different levels. But it's certainly not an easy approach, and yeah, as I said before, probably not a panacea for solving conflicts.
Then I go to the next question to Ali.
Thank you, Ambassador. Buonasera. Thank you, ambassadors, for sharing your insights and personal experiences. My question is more about you as diplomats rather than the process. Actually, you have touched a bit upon the possibility of unsuccessful mediation efforts. Could you share an example of a time when positive mediation efforts hit a deadlock in later stages? I would like to hear how your personal skills and strategies help to break the impasse and lead to successful resolution.
I look to my colleagues. Perhaps I would have a good story. It's a birthday cake who saved a negotiation process. So what happened? In 2014 to 16, I was facilitating prisoners exchange discussions in Geneva. So the delegations from 2 countries came 8 times to Geneva, in a hotel in Geneva. Everything was very secret. So nobody knew about this negotiation. Then it was the 31st December 2015. And it was really the time where we were at the end of the negotiations. And I thought it will be a happy end. This evening, 31st December, will be the final solution and they will sign. So I prepared a table, everything for the delegation. When they come back, we can have dinner together. Then it was midnight. Midnight in Geneva, I saw the fireworks from the hotel. Nothing happened, the delegation didn't come back. In the morning, at 2 o'clock, both delegations told me they will go home the next day. So one delegation who was very depressed, I remembered one of the members of the delegation had birthday on the 31st of December. So I prepared a birthday cake. So I asked this delegation, but don't go now bed. Let's celebrate, even it's a sad moment, this birthday. And they came together on this table and celebrated this birthday in a very sad atmosphere. At the end of in the morning at 4, I told them, but let's try again. So they called the capital, and the capital said, yes, try again next week, next day. I talked with the other delegation. Also there, they were ready to continue. So they continued another 14 days, and then the prisoner exchange deal was done, and it happened in Geneva, the exchange of these prisoners. So you see, sometimes a mediator with a little bit innovation, flexibility, an idea can help and save a situation. But perhaps my colleagues have also such a story. No, okay.
Chocolate.
Are you satisfied?
Chocolate always help.
You have a story?
Chocolate always help when you...
So that is my story in a very important facilitation process.
Thank you.
So next question is Haya.
Thank you, Excellencies, for this opportunity to exchange a conversation with you about the MENA region. Given the disruptive condition in the Middle East, do you think that mediation and dialogue are possible and relevant at any time in a discourse of war? And what's the relation between justice and dialogue?
Very difficult question also. This time you have to help me.
Yeah. Maybe just...
Monika?
No, sorry, yeah. I mean, the question is again so good and so profound, and my very short answer would be it has to be possible. And I, of course, I can feel, despite the very intellectual question, I can feel a little bit of, not frustration, but, the situation in the Middle East is very difficult. Maher was also underlying, like what does this mean for today? And I think we are all clueless. We are never clueless, but let's say we are not overly optimistic, probably all of us, but it has to be possible. If we cannot think about dialogue, if we cannot think about that we have to find a way out of this spiral of violence, then I think, then I wouldn't know what to answer. So my answer would be yes, there has to be a dialogue and there has to be a way out.
Thomas, you would also like? And then Florence.
Yeah, maybe 2 points. I fully agree with Monika that dialogue should be maintained. Now for negotiation, that's a different issue, I think. I think a conflict needs to be ripe for negotiations. And it can't always take place. So while a dialogue needs to be maintained, I think for the negotiation process, certain conditions need to be fulfilled. And if I think one of the strengths of my host country, Oman, is I think they they have a very good understanding when a conflict is ripe to be negotiated, and that's why they are quite successful, because I think they have developed a very good feeling, and sometimes when you are too early, it might not work, and then things might get worse. And the justice and dialogue part, that's of course a very, very difficult one. For a very long time, I was always of the opinion that negotiations and dialogue have to prevail, and that justice might need to be forgotten a little bit if it serves peace. But very often it's not very sustainable. You see, in those contexts where there hasn't been any transitional justice, it haunts you. So you might have a peace agreement, but in the longer run, things will come up again. So I'm less sure than I was maybe 10, 15 years ago, where I thought, okay, let's put justice apart. I'm not so sure anymore, because it might not be sustainable.
Florence also, for these questions?
Yes, well, as Thomas said, I think there is a time for negotiation, and sometimes we see it in Gaza, we see also in Ukraine. We're not there, because both parties need to be willing and have a good reason to negotiate. So in the Gaza-Israel conflict, there are no serious negotiation. We see it also Ukraine, Russia. We are not there yet. But what is important, it is what also Switzerland has tried with the Summit on Peace, is really to open different platforms where at least we try to have a dialogue and to engage on essential agreements. For example, this negotiation that was done also with Turkey. I think Qatar was also part of it, but just to allow for the wheat and the ships with the cereals to cross through the Mediterranean. So we try to pave the way with different dialogue. Qatar, for example, is helping to repatriate children, well, has a dialogue with Russia and Ukraine, repatriating children who have been abducted from Ukraine, so reunifying those children with their families in Ukraine. These are small steps that help to keep dialogue, and that can be very important for the day. It's building a platform for negotiation. It's important to keep contact, to build bridges. Often, for sometimes you can't do more than that, but it's already a lot. And trying to alleviate the pain also of the civil population with humanitarian aid, which is also a part to try to contain the suffering. And but the time has to be ripe, and parties has to be ready for negotiation if we want to have also a lasting peace, not a quick deal.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. So when an apple falls from the tree, it's the apple who decides when it's ripe. And I think the art in mediation is to find this moment. So next question, Gregorio from Mendrisio.
Buonasera a tutte e tutti. Good evening, everyone. Masal Khair Lijamia. Thank you, ambassadors, to be here with us tonight, answering our questions, first of all. I'm glad neutrality has been actually mentioned, since my question is exactly on this topic. For more than 2 years now, a heated debate on the status and condition of Swiss neutrality has been going on in the country. The concept of neutrality evolves over time, especially in such a complex world, adapting to current contingencies and needs. But how is the development of Swiss neutrality reflected in the professional life of a Swiss mediator or diplomats abroad? What concrete implication can it have in the eyes also of other states, of other partners? Thank you.
Grazie. Roberto, is that something for you?
I fear so. Yeah.
Grazie.
No, listen, thank you very much. By the way, I'm also from Mendrisio, so I'm talking to one of my fellow citizens. Very nice to see you on screen. Perhaps we should start with the beginning. And there is an easy answer to your question, is actually to explain to our partners around the world what neutrality is and what it is not. It's a constitutional maxim of Swiss foreign policy whereby we stand for peace, for consensus. We refuse actually war as a means to solve international disputes, which are precisely the principles of the Charter of the UN. Now, when it comes to international law, neutrality is anchored since 1907 in two conventions, the Hague Conventions, and this makes things a little bit more complicated in international customary law. And it says actually quite a very simple thing, that the neutral state is not allowed to support the military effort of a state which is at war with another state. So no troops, no military equipment, no use of its own territory to allow one party, one state to cross and fight to the other. It is limited to international conflicts, which doesn't cover internal domestic conflicts, and does not apply, and this is a very important point, when the UN Security Council decides to allow a military intervention. So what we are trying and doing these days is precisely to explain that to our partners. We have a limitation by international law to support military a state which is at war with another state. Does not mean that we cannot take part politically for a state. If you are referring to a war continuing, unfortunately, in Europe, then we condemn very clearly the aggressor in that war. We provided humanitarian aid. We even sustained and supported sanctions by the European Union to try and influence the decisions of the parties that we consider as being the aggressor. And this is part of what we call the policy of neutrality, which are actually the measures that a neutral state can take at peace or at war, which make credible and clear the measures that are taken according to the law. So, to answer your question, in fact, it has not big implications in what we are doing in foreign policy today, but for the fact that we need to explain and explain and explain in order for all our partners not to think that by being technically military neutral, we are supporting the aggressor. And this is quite a difficult task, especially, you know, when you face situations like we are facing today. And it's even more difficult task when we follow decisions which are perceived as being tantamount to not being neutral anymore. But if you're thinking, for instance, of economic sanctions by the European Union, we've been following them since 1993. So the sanctions we have taken these last 2 years against Russia are nothing new. There's a continuation of a standard policy we have been following for years. And actually neutrality, and this is my last sentence, is really a message of peace. It's not a message of an egoistic country not caring for what's going on in the world, but it's really a message of peace and of multilateralism and of the need to solve disputes or any kind of problems in a peaceful way.
Grazie.
Gregorio?
Prego.
Okay. Thank you very much, Roberto. When we are talking about neutrality, Oman is also a kind of neutral country in the Middle East, or has this perception. Thomas, when you how do you see Oman compared to Switzerland on that?
I mean, Oman defines itself not as neutral, but as equidistant. But I think essentially the DNA behind it is very similar. And I think that neutrality has had a bit a negative press in the past, but it's to a certain extent it's also a very modern answer to the current more and more divided world. Because I think you can't be neutral if you have a Manichaean worldview. If you think that everything is black and white, that there is right and wrong, and that it's very clear who is the perpetrator and who is the victim, then you can't be neutral. And I think neutrality, to a certain extent, is also to admit that the world is a lot of gray. It's not black and white. It's sometimes difficult, and there might be victims and aggressors on both sides. So. Yeah, to a certain extent, I think it's also a very modern answer, a different paradigm from what we are seeing, that there is more and more people feeling that it's either you are with us or you are with the enemy. I think this is not the DNA that neither we have nor Oman, who always sees itself as a go-between, is part of the GCC but has excellent relations to Iran and tries to build bridges. And I think this is in the end what we should do. We should try to bridge the growing divide between countries of the world that don't communicate anymore between each other.
Thank you. So, dear change makers, I would like to thank you very much for your questions, and also again for your commitment in the workshop we had on Tuesday. I discovered many skills in you, and I hope that many of you become a mediator. I would like also to thank my colleagues, ambassadors, very much for your commitment here on this panel and for your answers to very difficult questions. Thank you very much.